Hi, welcome back. In the last video, we took a brief look at the history of game theory, defined it by its parts, and took a look at some of the forms that games can take. In this video, we're going to address the fundamental assumption underlying game theory. Are people rational? Will they make choices that are in their self-interest? This was pretty controversial in the first 20 to 30 years of game theory research because oftentimes people seem to be making choices that were not in their best interests. To answer the question, are people rational, let's back way up. Life has been on this planet for almost 1 billion years. Natural selection has been a brutal judge as to what traits should get into the next generation and which traits go away. Traits that helped survive and reproduce got into the next generation, and the ones that didn't work as well have disappeared. Humans have been on the planet for about 5 million years in various iterations. About 2 million years ago, the first humans with large brains are on the planet, and about 250,000 years, the wildly successful Homo sapiens iteration was born. Have you ever watched a bird fly up to a tree, swoop up, land on a limb, and balance perfectly? The size of a bird's brain is about the size of a pea, and yet it can make complicated calculations that allow it to perform that maneuver. Humans have even larger brains that have been making complicated calculations for millions of years. It took until Isaac Newton to develop calculus, which is the study of motion, takes into consideration the effects of gravity, force, velocity. And yet humans were making instantaneous calculations hundreds of thousands of years ago when they were throwing spears and rocks at moving targets for dinner. This is called strategic intuition, or more commonly, bounded rationality. Let's compare bounded rationality, how most of us think we make many of our choices, the scientific method. In the scientific method, we list the options, we list the pros and cons of each of the options, and we choose the one that has the most pros and the fewest cons. Humans make almost none of their decisions that way. Most of our decisions are made through bounded rationality. Let's play a game. Read the instructions on the page that you see now. Okay, where have you decided to meet in New York, and at what time? If you're like most people, you will choose noon. 80% of subjects in actual research experiments chose noon as the time to meet the stranger. And 70% of the subjects chose one of 3 places to meet: Grand Central Station, under the clock usually, the top of the Empire State Building, or Times Square. And research shows that if 2 subjects are given this assignment, they are likely to meet 60% of the time in New York on August 8th. That's bounded rationality. The scientific method never would have solved that problem. We mentioned in the last video the concept of growing the pie by incorporating the objective and subjective values of the players. When people appear to be irrational, sometimes or often it's because they're playing for subjective payoffs that aren't easily observed by other people. So they appear to be irrational when in fact they might be gaining a subjective payoff that was worth it to them. When somebody bids on an antique desk, for example, that desk has no more object value than a desk you might buy at Staples, and yet people are willing to pay hundreds of extra dollars just because it's an antique, in the hopes, first of all, that they'll appreciate that it's an antique, and also, secondly, that someone else will appreciate it if at some point they decide to sell it. So subjective value can lead people to make rational choices that don't appear rational to others. However, people can also be tricked into making irrational choices. Group pressure experiments have found that people can be tricked into going along with the group even when they know that the group is incorrect. Perhaps the most famous experiment was done by Solomon Asch. He had 8 subjects sitting around a table, and he said that this was an experiment to measure people's perceptual abilities. He would put 2 charts up. One would have 1 line on it, and the other one would have 3 lines of different lengths. And the question he would ask the group is, which of the 3 lines equals in length the line that's on this chart? In the first couple rounds, all of the subjects would give the same answer. What the 8th subject didn't know is the first 7 subjects were in fact confederates of the researcher. So as he got to the 3rd and the 4th chart, 7 of the subjects began to give the wrong answer, and 75% of the 8th subjects would then give the wrong answer. In interviews after the experiment, those 8th subjects knew that they were giving the wrong answer and gave various rationalizations for doing so. But group pressure can shape our behaviors. Authority can shape our behaviors. A journalist witnessed the war crimes trial of Adolf Eichmann and was surprised that Adolf Eichmann was a bespectacled little man who said, "I was only doing what I was ordered to do." She wrote an article about that, and a researcher by the name of Stanley Milgram decided to test whether or not people would in fact comply with an authority and do something that goes against their values. He had a subject come into a room. There's a button on the table. He explained that this was a test of the effects of punishment on learning. There was a subject in the next room that was hooked up to wires. He was asked that subject questions. If that subject gave correct answers, nothing would happen. But if the subject gave incorrect answers, this subject was to hit the button and deliver an electric shock. The more wrong answers that were given, the more intense the electric shock would get. What the subject in the room with the button didn't know is that the subject in the other room was not hooked up with wires and in fact was a confederate of the researcher. And sure enough, the subject in the other room began to give wrong answers. The researcher told the subject with the button to hit it, and electric shocks were delivered of increasing intensity to the point where they would play recordings in the other room of somebody screaming in pain. And yet the subject with the button, 75% of them continued to give the electric shocks. Context can affect whether people make rational choices. The Stanford prison experiment is a good example of that. A Stanford professor had all of his graduate students split into 2 groups. One group would be the guards and one group would be the prisoners, and they constructed a simulation of a prison in the basement of one of the buildings. And the experiment was intended to last for 2 weeks, but it had to end after 6 days because the treatment of the prisoners by the guards was so brutal by that time. High emotions affect people making irrational choices. In times of high emotion, instead of the frontal cortex being engaged, the brainstem becomes engaged, and there's a sense of urgency and fight and fright and flight dominate the situation. Anonymity can affect whether or not people make rational choices. For example, let's play another game. I'll put $100 on a table, and player 1 gets to choose and propose what the split of that $100 will be. Player 2 then accepts the split and both get the money, or rejects the split and neither of them get the money. We're going to play 3 versions of that game. In the first version, you're sitting across the table from a good friend. What split do you propose? If you're like most people, you'll propose a 50-50 split. Now let's change the version, and the person sitting across from you is a stranger. Now what split do you propose? If you're like most people, it will be between 50-50 and 60-40. In the third version, you're sitting at the table alone. I put the $100 on the table, and you're asked to make a proposal to a subject who's sitting in a different room. Now what do you propose? In experiments, player 1 proposed somewhere between 70-30 and 80-20. In interviews after these experiments, the subjects were asked why they didn't make the rational choice of proposing a 99-1 split. That maximized the self-interest of the person making the proposal, and frankly, $1 is better than nothing, player 2 would likely accept. But that's not what people actually do. And this is a good example of subjective value because in those interviews, the subjects said there were two reasons why they offered a 50-50 or a close to 50-50 split. And that was they wanted to be fair to the other person, but they also wanted to appear to be fair to the other person. So there was being fair and there was the reputation of appearing to be fair at stake. What we conclude from these research experiments and games that have been tested, game theory research, is that people are in fact rational, particularly if you take into account both the objective and the subjective payoff values to the subjects involved. However, we also have learned that people can be fooled into making irrational choices. The implication that this has in the traditional family law system is that the traditional family law system uses group pressure, authority, context, and anonymity in a high emotion situation to get people to make irrational choices. Game theory does the opposite. In the next video, we're going to look at the way that the traditional law system tricks people into making irrational choices.